Okay, we are live. Welcome, everyone. We have one more that is joining. Ryan is here. Let's see here. Let's promote him to a panelist. Awesome. So everyone is here, so let's get started. Well, welcome to our guests and to our viewers to our December community conversation. This is our last one for the year. Our topic this afternoon is data collection and transparency in Oklahoma, a defunct system. Many may not know, but Oklahoma has a serious data problem. Our current data collection methods are antiquated and do not serve our needs. Our state currently has no visibility into key components of our criminal legal system, affecting the ability of policy and lawmakers to enact smart policies. I'm going to let our panelists educate us more on this topic because they are the experts. So let me introduce them. Our first one, and I'm going to go in alphabetical order, is Andrew Bell. Andrew's the Justice and Data Analyst from the Oklahoma Policy Institute. Then we have Ryan Kiesel, a civil rights lawyer and lobbyist for Oklahomans for Criminal Justice Reform. Welcome. Next, we have Nicole Zayas-Manzano, the Senior Policy Counsel for the Bell Project. Welcome, Nicole. And finally, Michael Olson, the Policy Counsel for Oklahomans for Criminal Justice Reform. Hi, Mike. And I am Evita Fox-Kreider, your moderator for the conversation. So let's begin. My suspicions are that many Oklahomans are unaware of how we collect data and don't even know why we need a more robust and aggregate data. So let's start there and level set. When we talk about government having good data collection methods, we are talking about transparency. Why is government transparency so important from a moral or even a democratic standpoint? And Nicole, I see you nodding your head. I'm going to throw it to you or to Mike, one of you to, explain this for us.
Sure. Happy to jump in. I think that government transparency is really two different things, right? It's partly about being transparent with the public, which is the people who are paying the bill at the end of the day for the criminal legal system and who should know where their money's going and how it's being spent, how efficient we are. But it's also about transparency within government, right? Different stakeholders, different parts of the government don't have a clear understanding of how the other parts are operating, what they're doing, and ways to make it better. And so I think generally speaking, the transparency component around understanding how pretrial systems and the criminal legal system broadly is working really requires all of us to be aware of what's happening on the ground. What does it look like? Who's going there? For how long? Is this the best use of our taxpayer dollars at the end of the day? And if not only the public doesn't understand that, but all of the other parts of the government don't understand that, then we are not only potentially wasting a lot of funding, but we're morally harming people inside of a system that we don't even understand very well.
That's really good. Well put. Mike, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, when I think about this issue, I always think like, what if I went into like, say, a financial advisor and he told me about a hot new company, but he wouldn't give me any information about what they make, the processes by which they made it, and how much profit they made. Would I invest in that company? And the answer is probably not. But the state of Oklahoma is continually asking for us as taxpayers to invest in the criminal justice system without any real way to measure outcomes. And that is really why data transparency is so important to the health of a democracy. We all learned in middle school civics that our entire governmental system is one of checks and balances. And the ultimate check on political power is, of course, the voters. And the voters need to have a way to accurately judge the effectiveness of policies in the criminal legal space in order to make decisions. And right now, everyone from lawmakers to police officers to the voters themselves really are flying blind. And that is not how the feedback machine of representative democracy is supposed to function.
Yeah, that's a really good analogy. And that would be really scary for me to invest my money somewhere where I had no view into what was happening. And unfortunately, that is what we are doing as Oklahomans. So let me move on to the next question. The past 2 decades, we've seen a growing demand for better data collection in almost every private sector industry, right? But often too much, like government is clunky, is outdated, and it's kind of skipped over. So this seems to be particularly true, which we've been talking about for our courts, the jails, and prison systems. And we touched on it, we talked about it, but like break it down for us. What exactly is the problem with Oklahoma's current methods? And Ryan, I'm going to give you this question.
Well, that's a big question to answer. So I'll rely on other folks on here to pitch in as well. I think one of the problems is, one, there's a lot of reluctance. There's political reluctance. We are talking about really one of, if not the most awesome power that the government wields over its people, which is the power to detain and incarcerate them, even for a short period of time. It's a really enormous power that we give our government. And typically, whenever you have a power that great, reluctance to give it up is equally strong. And so you have a lot of folks that become committed to a status quo, and they believe any deviation from that status quo is dangerous, or at least I really believe that they genuinely believe it's dangerous. I think that in their mind, convenience is substituted for danger, or danger is substituted for convenience all too often. But when you think about those conveniences, that's exacerbated by the situation where we're not just talking about one level of government. I think that if we were just talking about the state of Oklahoma, and there were one central purchasing entity, and there were one decision maker as to what platform would be used, then we would have a different problem on our hand. I don't want to say that eliminates everything, but we are dealing with 77 counties. And even in those 77 counties, we have different operators. So, in each of those counties, we have a county sheriff, and they're often, the gateway to folks going into a county jail, either because they're arresting them or they're doing intake for municipal police that are doing arrest. And then you have court clerks, and they're the elected officials in those counties that then process all of the judicial information for that county. And then you have about half of the counties in the state of Oklahoma right now are still on an old, antiquated system that's a private sector vendor that haven't been really updating their services for many, many years now. You had a transition to several of the state's judicial systems to the Oklahoma Supreme Court network, which in many instances is a wonderful resource for Oklahomans in terms of legal research. But when you begin to try to look for actual case information, it becomes incredibly cumbersome, and you'll find very quickly that there are enormous gaps in those records. And so we're dealing with political reluctance and a commitment to the status quo, but we're dealing with that across multiple levels of government, with literally hundreds of decision makers that all have a stake, and many of them don't want to do anything to change. And that's where we have a lot of our, I think that a lot of the problems right now is that we have systems that don't talk to one another, and there's no real incentive or motivation for those political actors and those decision makers to do anything different.
That is overwhelming when you think about it. I'm going to let someone else chime in, Nicole or Andrew, if you have anything you'd like to say.
I think another important aspect of this is that it's not just that there are that many different systems and data collections coming from different sheriffs and different county clerks. It's also that they're collecting different kind of information about their own little world, right? This particular sheriff decides that they want to count this thing. Another sheriff in a different place may not at all. Or even worse, because it can be tricky, defines it differently. And so it looks like they're collecting the same thing, and it's apples and oranges. You can't compare it. You can't even, because all of these things are separate, follow a case to see what happens to one person with one kind of scenario from the beginning to the end of their entire case and potentially sentence, right? you can only learn snippets and of what they want to show you from very individual offices.
Wow.
Just to add on to that too, in my experience, trying to sort of pull these different data sources together and get them to talk to each other, especially with like demographic categories, like how do you define like race, and do you ask the people that are being like arrested or whatever, do you ask them, or do you have the person who's arresting them impute that information? And so like you don't know if all of these different places are collecting the data in different ways and using different categories and different means. It's very hard to trust, even when you can get it pulled together, that they're all saying the same thing and they all mean the same thing. So just echoing what both of y'all said before, because that is very, very true in my experience as well.
Well, and just that, when you mention race, I think that demographic information is critically important to understanding, what and how law enforcement and the judicial system is treating people across racial demographic lines in the state of Oklahoma. But when you introduce that conversation, I was mentioning political reluctance, one of the concerns is that, well, wait a second, it's going to expose disparities along racial lines, or to expose disparities along gender, or the more demographic information we create, the better picture we can get about how law enforcement resources are being allocated, how prosecutorial decision making is happening, and understanding, are there conscious or subconscious factors that are going into these decisions. And rather than looking at that as an opportunity to kind of learn about our political and judicial systems and figure out how to make them better, I feel like so many of the political actors involved in this have wrapped them. They cannot distinguish their own ego from the actual institution, right? And so understanding that there's something wrong with the institution is like this idea that there's something wrong with them, that they are racist, or that they may be acting in a way that is misogynistic, or whatever that may be. I think that they're really concerned about, am I going to be labeled? Is this data going to be used against me somehow with some political agenda? I think that I think that you can have some empathy for that concern, but at the same time, these are, it's not individuals. We're talking about the systems that govern all of us, and if we're going to be making decisions, shouldn't we want to know the truth? Shouldn't we want to know whether the financial instrument that we're investing in, has a good record or a bad record? If you're making healthcare decisions, whenever my doctors don't walk in to have a conversation with me about healthcare decisions and only give me the information that they want to give me. They give me all the information, the good, bad, and the ugly. It might not be something that you want to hear, but you need to act on it. You need to be able to make decisions with everything on the table. And that's just not what we have right now.
Thank you. Thank you, all of you. My next question is, so in any kind of large organization, when you have different departments that need to work together some way, there's usually some kind of overarching department that is making sure these systems are working together. Is there one person or body that is ultimately responsible for record keeping in Oklahoma? No, I'm seeing a nod.
Currently, record keeping is required under the Oklahoma Open Records Act, but each individual agency is responsible for its own record keeping. So, like, for instance, a law enforcement agency is required to make records available to the public on things like demographics, but as we just heard, there's no guidance as to exactly how to collect that, or facts concerning the arrest, radio logs, things of that nature. But that obviously comes with a couple problems. First, the data isn't aggregated in a way that tells the entire picture. So you can easily, well, I shouldn't say easily because of all the requirements it takes for an Open Records Act request, but it's easier to get records on a certain individual, but nearly impossible to get aggregate data on all pretrial detentions or all arrests in Tulsa, for example. And those individual records aren't necessarily helpful to lawmakers, advocates, the public when they're trying to find systematic issues within the entire system. But there is a couple proposal that I'm sure we'll talk about later, but that would create a centralized source, and they would house it in OSBI, which is a natural choice because OSBI is already tasked with assisting state agencies with crime reporting. It houses the Statistical Analysis Center, which has the capacity and the authority to collect and publish data for further analysis. And OSBI also has proper security clearances so they could manage and scrub the data, getting rid of confidential things like social security numbers and things of that nature.
Okay, so in a better system, OSBI would be the one to collect this more robust data. All right. Well, so let me just to clarify, on any given day, are we able to tell how many people are detained pre-trial or are sitting in our prisons in Oklahoma, like get a accurate count?
Well, if you're asking about today and jails, the answer is unfortunately no. We just don't know that number across the entire state. There may be individual jails who are opening up some of their data or update the public generally, but for the most part, we don't know that. You'd have to go all the way back to 2015 to know what jails were in a single day back then. To give you a sense, that was 12,726 people in county jails on a single day. 64% of them were awaiting trial. Prisons, just to show the stark contrast between the different parts of this, are totally different. I looked up today that only 3 days ago, the Oklahoma Department of Corrections said that they had exactly 21,690 people under their control in state-run or private prisons and halfway houses. They had 20,488 people from inside the communities that they were monitoring, and they were awaiting arrival of 1,243 people through pending jail transfers, all publicly available, in stark contrast to how much we don't know about other parts of the system.
Mm-hmm. Andrew, I see you smiling, thinking.
I was smiling because I think Nicole did the same homework as me. I was reading those same numbers from my other screen. One thing I would add that, and I'm pretty sure you got those numbers from the PDF that they publish. Even when they do publish this stuff, they publish it in a PDF, which for that single day snapshot, which is not very useful if you want to go back and compare to the past, for example. And I wanted to add, so at Oklahoma Policy Institute, we have been working with CJAC, the Oklahoma County Criminal Justice Advisory Commission, to sort of help with their task of overseeing how the jail, the Oklahoma County Detention Center, is sort of going through its various horrible problems that I'm sure I don't need to explain to most people here. And so we have really good data for Oklahoma County Jail, the biggest jail in the state. And so, for example, I pulled some numbers from there just to give y'all some context. So as of our last data update on Monday, there was about 1,600 people incarcerated in OCDC, and around 80% of those people were pre-trial. That number usually is around 80 to 85% at OCDC. And we have that data published on a dashboard that you can actually go and look at historically, going back to even like 2015. You can see how it's changed over time, and you can sort of understand how our policy decisions have shaped the prison population, or the jail population there, excuse me. So I just wanted to add that some extra numbers because I did the same homework as you, and I had some extra OCDC information I thought might be useful. So.
No, that's great. And that's like what we're looking for from each different, right, county. Yeah. And just to clarify, are the people that are sitting in our jails pre-trial, have they been convicted of a crime? Mike?
No, and that's why this is so crucial, because in our system of innocent until proven guilty, these individuals that are detained while awaiting trial are legally innocent. And this area, I think we know, is ripe for reform, because at least in other states, we know that being detained pre-trial results in more guilty convictions and more plea deals. Because preparing a defense while you're locked up is very, very difficult. But because of the lack of data available about this, we have no way to test these hypotheses in Oklahoma to see what the issues are, to see if this is even an issue in Oklahoma.
Thank you. I'm going to move to my next question. So because of this shroud of ambiguity, or just because we don't hear a whole lot about it, most Oklahomans are unaware. Can you explain, well, you've already told us a little bit, like what's the snapshots that are available. What other type of data is accessible to the public? And what type of data do we want to be accessible? I know, Ryan, you mentioned some demographic information, but what are we really looking for, and how would that aid you all in your work at your organizations?
I'll let Nicole go first. She's the expert in putting together kind of that list of the Christmas wish list of things that we would like to have in terms of data, and then I can chime in there afterwards.
Sure. Well, we did work on a really long list that I will not make everybody sit and listen to the entire thing, but I can tell you there are dozens upon dozens, if not over 100, I think, different data points that we really thought here at the Bail Project would be fantastic for policymakers, stakeholders, and the public alike to know, to be able to look up, to be able to understand. Amongst some of the simplest things that we just wish we knew and could really run with is who's arrested, from where, how much does it cost to keep them in jail pre-trial, what kinds of cases are actually getting filed after arrest, how many people are just in our jails, to your question earlier, how long are they there for, and what do their cases end up looking like at the end. These are basic things that we don't know and don't understand. I would urge everybody to look up a bill that Michael referred to a little bit earlier, but earlier this year, HB 3848, the pretrial, I'm forgetting the total name, the Pretrial Act, would have allowed a really long laundry list of the kinds of things that honestly advocates, legislators, stakeholders, taxpayers should know. And it would allow them to see potential systemic problems that our lack of data honestly just obscures, would allow us to see stress points that require more support, more aid from the government to a particular stakeholder, and areas to brainstorm solutions. And to Ryan's point earlier, a lot of political actors in this space are very nervous about potential blowback or punishment, but I don't think they think often enough about being able to advocate even more strongly for the kinds of resources that you need, the kinds of issues you're facing, and to ask for broad help, even reaching out into experts inside of the public broadly to help figure out how to deal with an issue. Those are just some of it. So I will pass it right on back to Ryan to help fill in anything that I missed.
That's great, Ryan.
Yeah, I think that one of the just understanding who's in county jail, why are they there, but the ability to track multiple cases, not just an individual case, but just multiple cases in aggregate, so that we can understand. We have a decentralized criminal justice system, and that we have 26 district attorneys in the state of Oklahoma that are all making decisions and wield an enormous amount of prosecutorial discretion in how they make charging decisions, how they instruct their assistant district attorneys to accept or not accept plea deals, and they can really, through their own management and imposition of culture in an office, can have a huge impact on the way that prosecutions happen in one district versus another. And I think most Oklahomans, there's definitely a sense that as a state, right? If you're in Oklahoma and you do something, you might be held, to account different than you might if you were in New Mexico, or vice versa. But when we're all under the same statutes, the same criminal law, the same criminal procedures, there's a sense that it doesn't matter if you live in, Woods County or if you live in LaFleur County, you should have essentially the same justice and essentially the same outcomes. And we just don't know what's happening there. And we know, because we can find individual cases that we've become aware of through our advocacy work, that we do see these outliers. And we do see, well, why is this happening over here? Where if you'd been 10 feet over into another county, things would be totally different. I think that most Oklahomans don't want that kind of disparity. So when we talk about disparity on the basis of race, on the basis of gender, we have geographic disparity in the state of Oklahoma. And that's where I think it would be incredibly powerful, especially from the state legislative perspective, and also helping lawmakers understand why their area, because a lot of lawmakers will share districts with more than one district attorney, and so if I'm a lawmaker and I've got when I was in the state house, I had 3 different DAs in my legislative district. Well, it would have been fascinating to be able to see, well, what's happening over here versus over here versus over here. And I represent all of these people, but why is it that the people in Southeast Seminole County are getting a different deal than the people in Southwest Lincoln County?
Yeah, thank you, Ryan. I'm glad you brought that up, because my next question was to ask how petitioners of these agencies or these systems, how this lack of uniformity or a more uniform system would affect them. So being able to access data over several counties is one example. And, I know, and as well, my question would go to people that have to navigate these systems. How does it affect someone that who maybe has a case or has to go through these systems? I don't know. Can anyone speak to that?
I think another example, because I think it can come up in so many different ways. I can only think of little examples and not a beautiful way to sum it all up. But what about somebody who's dealing with cases in 2 different counties or with 2 different district attorneys, right, in the same place? I think that sometimes that can even just lead to a waste of resources for the entire system and for taxpayers in general. So, for example, if somebody is facing 2 different cases and ends up being found guilty in one, and now they are in jail awaiting their official sentence and to go on to wherever that is, another county is waiting for them to show up at their next hearing and doesn't understand what's going on and is thinking that they are trying to run away and are sending police out with warrants to go find this person. But because these police aren't talking to these police and this system isn't talking to this system and they can't look each other up in any way, shape, or form, they're wasting those resources looking for somebody, and we know exactly where they are, and they've done nothing wrong in that other case. So just the little things in life that you would assume these systems could talk to each other, know about each other, make some arrangement in some way to make sure we aren't wasting resources, that we aren't piling charges onto a person for something they haven't done wrong because we don't know where they are. That kind of stuff can really, really harm individuals, but also just the system in general.
Can really upend their entire lives, honestly. Yeah. And Andrew, you were nodding on, working for the Policy Institute, like you all have been such a real standard in data and informing our state on what's going on. Like, how does the accessibility data affect you? And then also weigh in on this next question. Sorry, there's 2 questions in one, but I'm going to let you just do your thing.
Well, the first thing that comes to mind in terms of, accessibility to data causing problems for people who are trying to make things better. So one of the groups that we work with is the Diversion Hub in Oklahoma City. And they're a group that basically helps people who mostly have like municipal or lower level charges, helps them navigate court and not make sure that they don't get failure to appear and pay warrants filed against them and stuff like that. Basically just helping them to try to avoid the pitfalls that often get people trapped in the system, basically. And one of the things that we've been trying to help them with is trying to help them figure out a way to track their success, basically. Like after a person quote unquote graduates from Diversion Hub, can we see that we've like set them up for success and they're not getting additional cases filed against them and so forth. But it's really hard to do that because there's no universal identifier for who is who in terms of the criminal justice system. We have to match the Diversion Hub records and the OSCN records by their name, which isn't perfect because people change their names and people have hyphenated names and people have typos in their names and all this stuff that makes it really messy. And I often think, like, if we had a universal identifier in the court system and in the jail system and stuff, this would be so much easier. And if they allowed Diversion Hub to access their data directly, it would be so much easier. And all these people who are spending like their life's work is to help make this system better and make it work better for people. And they would be able to do a much better job if they would only had access to this information that already exists. So that's the first thing that comes to mind. What was the second question you were asking about? Sorry.
Sorry. So I was asking about how it affects people that maybe navigate through the system, have to navigate.
Yeah. Well, like I said, if the people that are there to help you don't have access to the information, it's pretty hard to navigate as well. But yeah, I mean, the thing that we already mentioned earlier about people who were getting in trouble for failure to appear when they were in jail in another county, like I've heard stories of that as well, and I've heard even people in the legislature thinking about taking action on that. But we do a lot of work with fines and fees too. So I think about that with fines and fees too, because you can owe money in one county and not really know about it. And then it could get sent to collections and then you could find yourself getting calls about it. And so, yeah, I don't really have any other specific examples that are really parsimonious or whatever, but there are a ton of ways in which just not having everyone talking to each other can lead to really, really bad outcomes for individual people too.
That's great. Thank you all for chiming in on that. We do have a question from one of our viewers. So Jackie asks, what is the moral responsibility of the DAs and judges to study or take action against any type of discriminatory disparity, not just racial? And if we're going to be a state who stands on a mantra of accountability, then we need to ensure that the mantra applies to everyone. So this is to whoever would like to respond. What responsibility do our DAs and judges have to study and to, what onus do they have to be proactive?
I think we got tremendous responsibility to understand that. They are, in many instances, the most powerful political operator in the state of Oklahoma. They're the only elected official that has the power to take away your freedom, to take away your money, and in some instances, to even take away your life. That's enormous power, and they should absolutely be studying how their decisions bear out, and to be on the lookout for any sort of patterns that they need to address. I think that what I'm not arguing for, and I want to be careful about saying this, because I think that or careful to say this, because no, I don't think anyone on this call or any of the advocates that are asking for data or trying to understand patterns of discrimination that may exist in any facet of public life in Oklahoma. I don't think anybody here is arguing that a DA should ever make decisions in an individual case, dealing with individual questions of fact or individual questions of law based on some larger, broader data point, right? You shouldn't look at an individual case and even if it was even if it's what we might call like a good quota, right? This idea of like, well, wait a second, I've got to protect my data over here, so I can't prosecute this person, because if I prosecute this person for this thing, looking at their demographic profile, it's going to hurt my score or whatever that is, right? I mean, they shouldn't be making decisions like that, and we're not asking them to do that at all. But I think that if at the end of the year, you're a prosecutor and you can look back and say, man, everyone that we prosecuted for this particular crime was a low-income woman. What's going on here? How is it that, because we know that, men are committing this crime as well, or have the propensity to commit this crime. Why is it that we're only prosecuting women? Or maybe we did charge, men and women, but men got plea deals and women didn't. I'm thinking, again, it's difficult to extrapolate from an individual case, but when I was at the ACLU of Oklahoma, we represented a wonderful woman named Tondaleo Hall, who goes by Tony. And Tony was in a situation where she was not even the perpetrator of the offense, but because the prosecutor is upset that she wouldn't testify against her abuser, the prosecutor gave her abuser and the perpetrator of an awful violent crime against her young child a plea deal of time served in jail, awaiting trial, and Tony received decades in prison. And understanding that I can talk about Tony Hall's case all day long and the importance of it. And I think that it's important for everybody to understand her case and similar cases. But if we can think about that in the aggregate, I think that that makes a lot more sense in terms of being persuasive to policymakers and understanding, well, wait a second, we need to make a different change here, or even being persuasive to DA, short of changing the law, but understanding, we have a role in this. Our discretion have led to these outcomes. The exercise of our discretion have led to these outcomes, and a reassessment. And if a DA doesn't want to make that reassessment, even though we don't have a lot of competitive district attorney races in the state of Oklahoma, it is a competitive political position. You have to run for this office. And right now, as voters, if you have an incumbent district attorney running for office, it's very difficult to have any sort of real objective metrics to look at, what kind of cases were they prosecuting? What kind of cases got pleas? What kind of cases went to trial? How did they spend their budget? We just don't have that as voters. And I think that's a real shame. Shame's an understatement. It undermines the democratic process in Oklahoma by not having this information.
Thanks, Ryan. Go ahead, Nicole.
I definitely agree with Ryan that prosecutors should definitely be looking at their data for everything that he just said. I'll also say, though, that that's really true of every single stakeholder inside the system, and they can only access the data that they have access to. So it really underscores the need to understand the entire system, which requires all of them working together towards this goal. Moreover, I think to Michael's point earlier, OSBI is perhaps most capable of doing that at this point in time. And it's a bit more of a neutral party that takes away all of these political reasons why you might want to hide and not show your data, right? So I think it's important to put the responsibility on them, to hold them accountable, to be able to vote if that's what it comes to. But it's also important that we take a step back, pick somebody who can see all of the data and who has no political reasons to not show it as much as possible publicly.
Thank you. So I want to pull on this thread of accountability and the disparities. So there's been a push for lawmakers to enact racial impact statements. First of all, can y'all explain what those are and how maybe they have positively impacted legislation in conservative states like Iowa or New Jersey?
I can jump in on this. Racial impact statements are basically when there's a proposed piece of legislation, they have to look at what the impact would be on racial minorities and other minority ethnic groups, and to make sure that these policies aren't having unintended consequences on marginalized groups. And you can see this in places like Iowa, where they can ensure that new legislation isn't disproportionately affecting people, and they're using data to project out into the future to see, make sure that that's not happening. And when you think about it, it makes sense because back in the past, governments relied on paper basically, and advanced data analysis was impossible just because of the amount of data that was needed. They couldn't get it all in one place. But now there's been in the last couple of decades, there's been a huge advance in data collection techniques and things of that nature. So in the past, they were relying on intuition, expertise, anecdotal evidence, political beliefs to craft public policy, right? And that opens up the very passage of law and the function of society to numerous biases and logical distortions. And so Oklahoma is relying on these non-data things to craft public policy. And that can leave minorities and other groups just generally with unintended consequences. And I think, as Ryan pointed out earlier, it is important to point out that we aren't advocating for like a purely technocratic, only follow the data. There was some research in Australia that rather than replacing traditional non-evidence-based practices, what large amounts of data can do is they serve to guide policymakers within their existing political framework. So we're not looking to turn lawmakers into robots. We're looking to allow them to use data to better craft policy so it doesn't have unintended consequences.
Thank you, Mike. In a way, like if we were to say like pass racial impact statements here in Oklahoma, then that will force lawmakers to kind of do their homework a little bit and actually see what's going on, right, in their districts and whatnot. Okay, I feel like I cut you off, Ryan, at one point, but okay, I'm going to move on to the next question. Money. Oklahoma runs on money. What are the cost savings of having a better system? Like, do we know, like, if it would save us money at all? I imagine it would.
I think it's an investment that has an enormous return to the state. And I don't want to just dismiss the concerns of law enforcement and trying to protect their what their status quo is. But the status quo for a lot of county sheriffs in particular in Oklahoma is pretty miserable. And from a funding perspective, it was pretty eye-opening for me at Representative Blanchett. And we've had this whole thing, and I think it's the first time we're saying Representative Melody Blanchett's name. Representative Blanchett has been a champion in just really digging into this issue of pretrial data. And really, without her, there wouldn't be anyone out at the Capitol that's just made this a priority. There are other lawmakers that have now dug in on this. In particular, Chairman Justin Humphrey in the Oklahoma House. But this is, really Representative Blanchett is really the spark that started this at the state Capitol. So, but Representative Blanchett had an interim study a couple of months ago at this point. And one of the things that came out there was a county sheriff showing up and saying, he was starting armed deputies, I think like around or less than $2,000 a month gross pay, which is pretty wild. And that they had several positions that were unfilled in their office. They couldn't hire people. Well, how are you going to hire people for a job that's putatively dangerous at any given moment, and you're going to pay them nothing? How's that going to happen? There was, and again, this everybody's got their own theories about why things the way that they are. This sheriff, it was interesting. He was saying like, oh, I've got this low pay and I can't afford these people, and he seemed to indicate that the reason that he couldn't hire people was because police officers are just constantly under scrutiny in the public eye now, and it's not cool to be a cop anymore. I don't think that that's it. I think it's if you're paying somebody $24,000 a year gross to do a very difficult and in many instances hard job, especially these rural counties. I'm a rural Oklahoma guy. If you're a sheriff's deputy and you're off in some far-flung part of a rural area, you might be the only person out there. Your backup may be 30-40 minutes away. And so it's a difficult job. You're paying them nothing. Well, why do I say all of this? If I'm a county sheriff right now and I'm budgeting and I'm trying to get the county commissioners to approve my budget, because there's a crazy, the funding of county sheriffs in the state of Oklahoma doesn't come from the legislature. They're being funded by county dollars for the most part. So if they're trying to make their budget, what I've been told anecdotally is that many of these sheriffs, in particular rural sheriffs, go in and they just ask for a percentage increase over and above what they got last year. And that's a terrible way to budget. One, there's probably some waste in there that we can get rid of by just saying, just like add 10% or add 15%. But the real problem is that they're not able to adequately demonstrate their needs. They're not able to say, what do we need in terms of policing in this area? What do we need in terms of, we have a bunch of jail intake, but we've only got one jail intake officer. Oh, well, it looks like most of our jail intake aren't well, or they have a lot of mental health issues. It'd be great if we had a jail intake officer that had some mental health experience, or at least some training or certification, whatever that might be. I feel like there's a real benefit to law enforcement agencies, and not just at the county level. The Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation, they at this interim study talked about how they can't recruit and retain key personnel. I think that they have for years out at the Capitol, the sheriff's lobby, I think for a decade plus, been lobbying for an increased pay to county sheriffs, and they haven't got it. In a state that is, I don't know how many, back the blue bumper stickers that I drove by this morning as I was out and about in Oklahoma City, but you see them everywhere. Blue Lives Matter. You got the American flag with the blue stripe on it. But put your money where your mouth is. And I think one of the things is that we just don't know where to put the money. We don't know how to allocate it, and so we just kind of we're just throwing money at it right now, and it's not necessarily going to where it needs to be going.
It's being fiscally irresponsible, actually.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Ryan. So let me ask then, because we've talked about the problem. Are there any proposed ideas for a better or more robust data collection and storage system? Or are there any bills or reforms that are being proposed currently as a solution? And if so, what would they do? Mike or Ryan, Nicole?
Well, I mentioned it earlier, but earlier this year, Representative Blanchett proposed the Pretrial Data Collection Act, which included what I started to talk about earlier, dozens upon dozens of different data points that it would be amazing if everybody had access to, would have had OSBI be the infrastructure that tackled this issue and would help us begin to mandate that kind of information be collected, reported, and then in an aggregate way, so we're not necessarily, knowing people's social security numbers, to Andrew's point earlier, being publicly released so that we better understand the entire system. Earlier this year, she introduced that so that we could start that conversation with policymakers and stakeholders. And we're really excited in the hopes that it's going to reemerge stronger and better than ever this upcoming legislative session. So we're really excited about that.
Awesome.
I also had something that is Oklahoma County specific, but I think it might be worth mentioning in case anyone's interested. So I know CJAC, that Criminal Justice Advisory Commission, I know they've been talking and doing some preliminary sort of looking into developing like an Oklahoma County data hub for criminal justice. And I think the main idea is to connect the courts and the jail specifically, because there's a lot of ground that we could cover if we could get those two things connected with, like I said, the diversion hub and things like that. It could really help to get people out of the jail, basically, and to help hopefully start to clean up some of the problems that are in the jail. And so I know they've started looking into like who has the data that we need, where can we get it from, how are we going to actually get it all feeding into one central hub so that we can look at it to use to make decisions. And they're in the early stages of that. And like I said, it's sort of Oklahoma County centric, but another effort that that might be useful for people to know about.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. Mm-hmm. Are there any states that we are looking at right now that are similar to Oklahoma and that have now begun to use data more efficiently, like that we can say, okay, this is kind of a North Star in a way, or going to lead us to our North Star at least?
I think that we've seen these kinds of efforts in states across the country. I mean, this is not totally unique to Oklahoma, right? This is pretrial systems remain the least known parts of the systems across the country. Florida, Virginia, Utah, Connecticut, Michigan, and Colorado have all done or at least proposed legislation around these issues, whether it's just a part of the criminal legal system or the entire thing, looking at jails, looking at courts, looking at comprehensive systems across their entire states. I think that Michigan, though it's still considering a data bill that would do this regularly, much like what we're talking about here, did do a task force that looked at a one-time analysis of what this could look like, right? In 2019, they had a bipartisan task force travel across the state to 20 different jails there to better collect and understand the data about what was impacting the jail populations, from arrest data, court data, probation, parole, all of the different parts of the system that would feed into the size of the jails there. And what they discovered was that they really hadn't known much about who was going into the system, why, how long were they there, why were they coming back if they were released and then coming back, and ultimately released their findings in early 2020, along with a list of policy recommendations to their legislature to really consider to reduce the overcapacitated jails throughout the state. A lot of what they learned is that the people who were going to jail just aren't the people that you would expect. The number one reason people in Michigan were going to jail, according to that analysis, was because of drivers' driving issues, traffic offenses, really, honestly, silly things at the end of the day. We're not talking the DUIs. They would take that out and just isolate what was silly traffic offenses at the end of the day. It was the number one reason that people were going into those jails, who were stuck there for so long. And honestly, the legislature began to run with it. 2020, as you can imagine, was a very chaotic year to try to pass legislation when dealing with a pandemic going across the entire country. But they managed to pass 7 different bills that would stop the flow of people coming in, including decriminalizing the simple traffic offenses and increasing cite and release options for police so that they didn't feel like they had to arrest, that they could just give you a ticket and tell you to go to court or pay it in the future. They're still contending with a bill that would do this data collection analysis annually and allow the legislature and the public to continue to monitor the issues that they're seeing inside of their jails. I think it's a great analysis of what we could and should be doing here in Oklahoma. And we should be jumping to where they are now, considering that ongoing data collection so that it's not a one-time thing like we had in 2015, but now 7 years later, I can't tell you how many people are in our jails.
Well, that's great what they're doing. Hopefully we can take a lesson out of their playbook and, learn from what other states are doing that have been successful. I want to ask, and this is, kind of where it leads all to the point of to get things passed in our state. What can everyday Oklahomans do to support you all's efforts to bring more transparency to our criminal legal system, more accountability, better data? What can we do? It's open to anyone to respond.
I wrote down 3 things that I can just go through real quick that will hopefully be a good starting point. The first thing that I wrote down is actually getting the data that we already have and putting it in front of the people who need to see it. Because even though all of these issues that we've talked about are there is still a lot of data out there. Like even just that data we have from the Oklahoma County Jail, there's so much interesting stuff that could be pulled out of there that's just more than I alone can do, or there's stuff in there that I can't see because of my perspective or whatever. So just getting that data that's already there and putting it in front of lawmakers and people who have power and can give money to stuff, that's really useful in and of itself. Second thing on my list was making transparency and data collection like an issue unto itself. And we've already kind of talked about that with like those bills in the legislature, but outside of criminal justice reform more broadly, just making it an issue. We want to know, we want to have data, we want to be able to know what's going on. That transparency, democracy aspect of it is a really good place to push, I think. And then finally, I just wanted to note that this is like not something that the legislature could solve by itself, or that any county government could solve by itself, or any particular court official or whatever. This is like every level of government, every part of government has to be involved in getting all of this data together, in collecting all the data, in deciding what kind of standards we want to have and what kind of categories we want to use, and all of that stuff. And also continuing to think about those things, because like the categories that we use to describe race are probably going to change in the future. The categories that we describe to think about different kinds of crimes are going to change in the future. So we need to have like an ongoing, discussion about this, and we need to institutionalize it so that it can be carried into the future. But those are my 3 things that I wrote down. If hopefully they provide a good jumping off point for y'all.
Those were great.
I think I would say absolutely ditto to all of that. A few things that I wrote down was just get your voice heard, right? Go ask anybody involved in government, because to Andrew's point, they all need to lean in onto this. Ask for basic information that you think you should know about this system, and you will see them struggle and squirm and say they don't know. And then point out that no one knows that. And we don't know it across the entire state. And shouldn't you be doing something about that, right? And if they don't vote, most of these people are, elected into office and are responsible for spending your taxpayer dollars wisely and for ensuring that issues you care about are lifted up and prioritized. And this has for far too long been deprioritized. No funding is available. Only a few people want to champion it. And I think that we need our voices heard in as many ways as possible, either directly or indirectly through voting.
So thank you, Nicole.
Yeah, I think that ultimately there needs to be a recognition that this isn't a partisan issue. And so I know that there are a lot of Oklahomans who feel like, well, I can't pick up the phone and call my lawmaker because they are very different than I am in terms of their political ideology. They're not even going to listen to me. Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons that I like working in criminal justice reform so much is that it does allow you to work in a way that is in many, but not all, but in many instances, a nonpartisan atmosphere where you have these really motley coalitions of people that would otherwise never be in the same room together. And I think that that's kind of exciting. And so I would encourage Oklahomans of all political backgrounds to pick up their phone and call their lawmakers, to call their district attorneys, to call their court clerks. Their court clerk probably has never received I doubt that there's a single court clerk in the state of Oklahoma that's ever received a phone call from a constituent saying, would you please, as my court clerk, commit to improving the amount of data that myself as a constituent and our other policymakers have access to? Mm-hmm. What a big ask, and what a simple ask. And let that court clerk, it's easy for them to come to the Capitol with their lobbyist and sit in a room and let their lobbyists talk about, well, this is an unfunded mandate. But let them tell a constituent, no, I'd rather use CalPro, this broken, antiquated system that we pay an arm and a leg for and doesn't do a damn thing. I'd rather just keep that. Let them tell a constituent that because they can't. So pick up the phone, call these elected officials. Don't just call your state legislator, but pick up the phone and call your court clerks and say you expect more. Pick up the phone and call your DAs and say you expect more. Pick up the phone and call your county sheriff and say, Sheriff, I want to help you better understand how to operate and manage your jail in an effective, humane, efficient manner. And we need better data to do that. So, I would love to see the first court clerk that gets a phone call from a constituent saying, I want this, because they don't get those calls.
Thank you, Ryan. Mike, do you have any?
Yeah, I just want to echo what everyone said, basically, that people should interact with their government representatives. But I also think it's important to note that, as Ryan was saying earlier, that this data collection system isn't out to get anyone. It's not out to get lawmakers. If anything, it could actually protect them in the future, avoid maybe the worst thing that a lawmaker can happen to them is a policy failure, enacting a policy that fails and harms Oklahomans, because that has political repercussions. So when you look into the research about why policies fail, there's several basic reasons. And those are like the government trying to solve a problem whose source or solution is unknown, failing to anticipate unintended consequences, as we talked about with the racial impact statements, or a variety of different implementation failures, or failing to effectively evaluate policy processes and outcomes. And every single one of these issues can be cured, or at the very least reduced, through the use of impartial evidence and data on the aggregate level. So the lawmakers can know that this isn't out to get you. It is actually here to protect you and to protect the Oklahoman citizens from policy failures.
Wow, thank you all. Thank you for sharing your expertise. And this concludes our panel. Really appreciate y'all for spending the hour with us. Just to kind of, recap those last points, use the data that is accessible, educate yourself, let your voice be heard, call your elected officials, especially those court clerks. Maybe you can get a recorded response and see how they respond, and interact with your lawmakers. But if you want more information on these issues, you can check us out at okjusticereform.org, or check out the websites of our guests today, the Bell Project and the OK Policy Institute. Thank you all again for being here, and have a good evening or good day. It's not evening, it's afternoon. All right, bye.
Thank you.